Welcome back, focused learners, to another explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely fascinating paper that dives headfirst into one of the most famous historical mysteries of the ancient world. We are looking at the deeply mysterious, totally undocumented decades of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, whether you approach this through the lens of history, philosophy, or theology, the source material we're examining today presents a really compelling hypothesis. It asks where he went, what he studied, and how a massive, worldly education might have radically redefined his understanding of his own mission. So let's jump right into part one, the missing years mystery. Think about the timeline of his life for a second, and you'll notice a staggering blank space right in the middle of it. We have the birth narratives, right? That includes his family's flight to Egypt. Then we see him at age 12, left behind in Jerusalem, famously spending 3 days astonishing the rabbis at the temple. And according to our source, simply knowing the basic laws of Exodus or Leviticus wouldn't have astonished these top-tier scholars. To truly impress them, this 12-year-old would have been disputing complex Talmudic concepts, using things like Rabbi Yishmael's 13 rules, which is a highly advanced system of logical deduction and legal precedent. But then, nothing. An 18-year gap. He literally vanishes from the historical record, only to reappear at age 30, walking out of the desert to begin his ministry. Which brings us to the absolutely crucial question of this whole explainer. Where does a 12-year-old prodigy, someone who is already capable of holding his own against the highest scholars of his religion, where does he go to continue his education? Because he clearly didn't just stop learning. Well, our source author proposes a brilliant and honestly a highly logical hypothesis. He didn't just stay in the rural towns of Galilee. He went to the absolute epicenter of global knowledge, the Great Library of Alexandria. Which leads us to Section 2, Destination Ancient Alexandria. You have to realize Alexandria wasn't just another city. As the source describes it, you kind of have to think of ancient Alexandria as the Hollywood and Harvard of the ancient world, all rolled into one. It was the beating heart of cultural life in the Roman Empire. It sat right at the mouth of the Nile, meaning it controlled maritime trade from the Red Sea, India, Africa, and the Far East. And right at its center was the Great Library, acting as a literal magnet for intellectuals, scholars, and scientists from across the known world. And this actually explains why Alexandria makes so much sense logistically. Remember that early timeline? Jesus' family had already fled to Egypt when he was an infant to escape King Herod's massacre. They likely went to the land of Onias, which was a really well-established Hellenistic Jewish quarter. This means returning to Alexandria as a young adult wouldn't be some random, dangerous journey into the unknown. He very likely had second or third cousins there. He had a community network for room and board. The author even suggests a young scholar could easily find work by day copying manuscripts, right in the neighborhood of the library itself, just to support his studies at night. All right, moving on to Section 3, the Hellenistic Jewish world. To really get this, we need to talk about the Hellenistic Jews. These were Jewish populations who fiercely observed Jewish law and paid their tithes to the temple in Jerusalem, but they spoke Greek at home and were completely integrated into the broader world. The cultural boundaries back then were incredibly blurred, much more so than history sometimes remembers. The level of integration here was just astounding. Since the time of Alexander the Great, who, by the way, highly respected Jewish scholars, many in this diaspora actually held Macedonian passports. They were wealthy, they were powerful, and they were deeply embedded in the system. We're talking generals for Egyptian armies and top-tier bureaucrats. In fact, there's this amazing historical anecdote from the text. The Ptolemaic rulers were so desperate to have the Hebrew Bible in their great library that they literally bought thousands of Jewish slaves their freedom. That was just the price to get the texts translated into Greek. So this was a thriving, cosmopolitan, and profoundly intellectual Jewish world. Okay, let's look at Section 4, Curriculum for Messiah. The curriculum available at the Great Library was just staggering. Our source postulates that Jesus would have absorbed the greats, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus. But it goes way beyond Greece. Because Alexander's trade route stretched all the way to India, the library actually held translations of the Indian Vedas and the Arthashastra, which is an ancient treatise on statecraft. Think about it. A young man trying to deeply understand humanity, suffering, and justice would have consumed all the world's wisdom, not just his own cultural texts. Plus, he would have had access to the early stages of Kabbalah and advanced mystic meditation. That is knowledge that was simply unavailable to a 12-year-old boy back in Galilee. The explainer basically outlines it like a modern academic track. Step 1, he reaches adulthood and has his bar mitzvah in his homeland. Step 2, he travels to Alexandria for his college years, absorbing the global sciences, philosophies, and histories of the Great Library. And then Step 3, He returns to the Middle East, heading into the desert for his postgraduate studies. He spends years in prayer and mystic meditation with groups like the Essenes, a strict ascetic desert sect, to synthesize everything he learned before finally stepping onto the public stage. Next up, Section 5, Redefining the Savior. To really grasp his radical shift in thinking, we have to understand the traditional expectation of the time. The Jewish people back then were looking for a militant political liberator. They wanted a new Moses or a new Judas Maccabee. Basically, someone who would call down the wrath of God, incite a violent rebellion, overthrow the oppressive Roman regime, and establish an independent national state. That was the job description. But Jesus completely flipped this expectation on its head. He shifted the paradigm from a militant political liberator to a peaceful spiritual guide. Why? Well, the source argues that a highly educated young man who had studied global history would know that the previous successful violent rebellion, the one led by the Maccabees, ultimately resulted in a deeply corrupt, ruthless state. He realized that simply swapping Roman governors for corrupt local kings wouldn't actually fix the human condition. So instead, he aligned his vision with the Talmudic concept of the seventh eon of humanity, the Sabbath eon. A messianic age defined by peace and living through the Spirit, completely regardless of who sat on the political throne. Finally, let's look at Section 6, a deeply human search. The author pulls this famous quote from the theologian Thomas à Kempis, "Imitate Christ." And the source challenges us with this. If we are supposed to imitate him, we absolutely must recognize his journey as a deeply human search. He had to struggle, he had to research, and he had to seek out the truth, exactly like any of us do. This is the core theological argument the author makes, and it's a powerful one. Even if you hold the devout belief that Jesus was God made man, the author insists that he didn't simply walk around with all the answers preloaded on some divine lookup tablet in his head. To truly understand humankind, he had to be intellectually human. He had to ask skeptical questions. He had to read, synthesize, and grapple with the absolute cacophony of the world's sins and philosophies entirely on his own. And that leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. Think about the night before his execution at the Garden of Gethsemane. He was terrified. He was sweating, doubting, and questioning his path. The source argues that if his time in Alexandria was real, then his sacrifice wasn't just some pre-programmed cosmic event. It was the hard-won, completely conscious decision of a brilliant, worldly scholar who had studied every philosophy, understood the exact, brutal weight of what he was doing, and chose to walk forward anyway. Honestly, it makes his humanity, his education, and his ultimate choice infinitely more profound. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, Focus Learners. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.